Great. So if you haven't yet, please do put your name and organization and the part of the country you're calling in from into the chat. It's fun to see. And I will just go ahead and get us started. Welcome to this election results debrief on what happened related to children and youth on the ballot this past November. I'm Elizabeth Gaines. I'm the CEO of Children's Funding Project, and we're an organization that's almost 5 years old. And a lot of the folks that you see on the screen here were there when we were just a twinkle in the eye. And our organization is really focused on how to support state and local leaders to make sure we've got across this country in all corners and all pockets, equitable, sustainable, flexible funding to use to support our children and youth in their development from the time they're little to the time they're big. So we do that in a number of ways. And one of the ways is what we're going to be talking about today. And that is focusing on how we can bring some of that power of the voters and the ballot to our field, because our field hasn't traditionally done it. We've got some of the original people here, the OGs of children's funds in this webinar, and we're trying to make sure that that's happening all across the country in lots of different ways. So we are co-hosting this webinar with Margaret Brodkin from Funding the Next Generation. That's our sister organization in California. And Margaret's one of those OGs who was there in the very beginning days doing this in San Francisco and now all parts of California. We want to talk a little bit about the success of most recent elections. So folks may or may not have heard in 2020, November 2020, we had really what we called a mini children's wave. I know folks were at that time looking for a red or a blue wave in various pockets of the country, but what we saw was a miniature children's wave with a lot of these local measures to generate new revenue for kids at the ballot being super successful. And so that was really encouraging to us. Then COVID happened and we saw an influx of, all of the different federal funding streams that have been created as a result of that, and really communities grappling with what to do with those resources. We also in that, period since 2020 to now saw Build Back Better as something that could potentially be a game changer, especially in the early childhood space. And so a lot of folks were organizing around that and encouraged about that, and then really deflated about the fact that that didn't end up happening. And speaking of deflated, we also then have been dealing with inflation. And so a lot of things have happened since 2020, but we want to now turn to this panel and hear about what happened November, this last month, with kids' issues at the ballot. So I first want to turn to Olivia Allen, who's strategy director at Children's Funding Project, and she's been supporting cohorts of communities that are trying to do this. Her and Josh on her team have really been in the trenches with people. So Olivia, you want to talk about when we say voter approved children's funds at Children's Funding Project, what we're talking about?
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. I'm going to go ahead and put we promise we don't have too many slides, but just put a map up on the screen to show you all the range of what we're talking about when we talk about voter approved children's funds. So when someone says they're going to talk about the election, they could be talking about candidate races at the federal level or the results of an effort to flip a state legislature. But what we're talking about here today is the opportunity that elections present for voters to use direct democracy to dedicate more public funding to kids. This happens via ballot measure. So those are the questions that you see on your ballot that aren't about candidates. When a question is placed on the ballot that asks voters whether they want to raise their property taxes to fund early childhood, for example, or set aside part of their annual budget for youth services, and voters say yes to dedicating public dollars to kids, it creates what we call a voter-approved children's fund. Those funds exist in the 50 communities across the country that you see highlighted on this map, and together those generate about $1.5 billion annually for a variety of children's programs and services. Children's Funding Project and Funding the Next Generation care so much about monitoring and supporting these funds and their proliferation across the country in part because they provide sustained, flexible, accountable funding for a lot of the programs and services that are typically underfunded in communities, like children's mental health, nurse-family partnerships, or childcare. And these funds act not only as pots of flexible, sustained funding, but also play a critical role in documenting the changing needs of their communities and adjusting and adapting to those, as well as connecting parents and families to programs and providers to one another, and programs and providers to funders and policymakers. So during COVID-19 pandemic, for example, we saw really great examples of these funds playing a critical role in helping programs get PPE or apply for state and federal emergency funding or connect with essential workers who needed childcare, and really provide an infrastructure to keep a real system of care around kids in their communities.
So then
Perhaps,
tell us a little also about the two places that we tracked. We're going to do sort of a round robin of across the country measures that we were tracking. And Olivia, if you could, there's some, yeah, there you go. Talk to us about New Mexico and about Whatcom County.
yeah, so this year on the ballot, there were all of the measures that you see on this slide, and we'll share this slide with folks. I believe there's a version we're going to drop in the chat so that I can pull this down and you can see our faces. So I'm going to talk about Whatcom County, Washington, and New Mexico. Whatcom County, Washington is where a real labor of love has turned into millions of dollars for kids this year. We met Whatcom County, the team there, back in 2019 at our joint Children's Funding Institute with Funding the Next Generation in Denver. Whatcom County is a more rural county than lots of these places, and it's in the northwest corner of Washington state, bordering Canada. It's home to about 228,000 people and has the same poverty rate as the nation, just over the national average at 11.7%, though the median income is a couple $1,000s over the national average, just to give you a quick picture of what this county's like. And this November on the ballot, Whatcom County voters were asked to approve a new property tax that'll increase by 19 cents per $1,000 valuation until it maxes out in 10 years and will generate approximately $8.2 million to expand high quality, affordable childcare and protect vulnerable children at risk of poverty and experiencing homelessness. So there are a couple interesting parts of that story. The first being the turnout, which was at the high end of our expectations at 70%. If you look at the graphic we shared, you'll see that's comparatively very high, especially in a midterm year. Turnout in Whatcom County is traditionally very high. The last presidential election, it was at 87.94%, which is a little bit bananas. And turnout is usually about a third less than in a presidential year. So you're thinking 65 to 70%. So turnout was really high. But what's funny is even though turnout was so high, it came down to 20 votes exactly. So a big lesson learned from this one is that the election doesn't necessarily end on election day. All through Thanksgiving and the holiday, the team in Whatcom County, Washington was waiting on new batches of ballots being counted. Washington is a vote by mail only state. So they were waiting to hear about ballots being counted for weeks and weeks. And then finally, we're also working to cure ballots. And curing ballots is a typical process that happens in every election. It's where people scramble to make sure that voters fix ballots that were rejected because of a signature issue or a date issue or a marking issue. And they were able to cure enough ballots that they actually were able to get a different result than prior to ballots being cured. And that's typical, that things, when it's that close, curing the ballot will be the difference. So that's a really interesting piece of the puzzle there. But
not for the faint of heart, it is for very fierce advocates.
And also for fierce advocates is the following, just earlier this week, the county council tried to lower the tax rate and that voters had approved, and they were unsuccessful. They voted not to do that in the end, but advocates were up late into the night at the public hearing sharing why they shouldn't do that. So this one really didn't end on election day. and finally got squared away this week. The one other lesson I want to share from this one that I think is widely applicable before we move on, but there's many of them before we move on to New Mexico, is that they had to make the choice about whether to pursue a fund early on in the county, Whatcom County, or in Bellingham, which is the city seat of Whatcom County. Voter wise, it would have been much easier to pass in Bellingham, but it would have generated less money and helped way fewer of the kids that need the most help in the county, who many of whom live outside of Bellingham. So they gave themselves a much tougher fight for a higher impact. And that's a choice we see a lot of communities across the country making. As they're deciding, you know, what is our community. Elizabeth often says, you know, there's no places, there's only people in places. So you often live in a city and a county and have to make the decision of which jurisdiction to pursue a dedicated fund in.
The mini update on New Mexico, because it's sort of one of these kids doing its own thing in this list.
Yeah, New Mexico is a really interesting case that lots of people have probably already heard of, but for those who haven't, it's a constitutional amendment that dedicates an additional $126.9 million annually of public dollars to early childhood. So what happened there is that the New Mexico state constitution lays out this land grant permanent fund, which is essentially the government has a bunch of public land and it collects lease revenue and royalty revenue on the oil and gas industry that uses those public lands. And it puts that funding in a trust that accrues more revenue via interest on investments. So they are very careful to draw out an amount of revenue each year from that fund that keeps the fund growing. And there's big debate over how much can you pull out before the fund stops growing and will eventually decrease to nothing. So that was really the question on the ballot for folks this year. And voters decided, yes, we want to pull out an additional 1.5%. So now they'll be pulling out 6.5% of the fund's average over 5 years. And they are dedicating 60% of that 1.25% to early childhood education, to the New Mexico Early Childhood Education and Care Department. People's biggest questions were, can we do that in our state? And the answer is maybe. There are a good number of states that have land grant permanent funds. They often call them something different. Nebraska actually in 2006 voted on a similar constitutional amendment that changed the definition of common school, which is the beneficiary of their fund, to include early childhood, which allows $10 million a year to go to the Nebraska Early Childhood Education Endowment. So Nebraska's already kind of done this. And if you do decide to do this, it's incredibly popular. You're not taking money, you're not taking new tax money from voters. And this campaign won with a huge margin of support at 70% support, split across parties. New Mexico only has 44% registered Democrats, 31% Republican, and 22% independent. So you can, it's a fair statement to say it was across parties, though definitely had greater initial support from Democrats.
And certainly more case studies will be coming out about New Mexico.
Yes.
Lots of folks paying attention to it, a lot of money spent on the campaign. I think, Margaret, let's turn to you and hear about what happened in California. You've got all the war wounds. You wanna...
Yeah. And I do want to say that what happened in New Mexico is everybody's favorite kind of tax, which is reallocating existing dollars, not a new tax. And as we'll all tell you, and as California people need to understand, this is an absolutely viable alternative. We got $1 billion for arts in the schools statewide with the same kind of strategy. So we had 3 great campaigns in California. Everyone was a super campaign. They did it extremely well. They were professionally run. They had enough funding. It uplifted the voices of our issues. It helped people organize the base. It helped people develop, really model policies. Each campaign also had an elected official, at least one, who was a champion of the campaign. So first I'll tell you about Sacramento. Sacramento passed a $10 million youth fund. It was complicated. Don't ask now, but I'll tell you later. It was a set aside of 40% of the cannabis dollars taken. No, it was actually, I take that back, they'll kill me. It's a set aside of the general fund of what equals to 40% of the cannabis dollars. It got 62% of the vote. But the thing you need to know, it was their third try on the ballot. First try, it was led by a very motivated, who stayed involved till the end day here, member of the city council. Second, it was initiated by a group of kick-ass youth advocates who put a measure on the ballot. Neither of them got the votes that they needed. The third time, it was a compromise effort among the leadership, the champions, the young people. It was essential that everybody get involved, and the mayor. And I will say one other thing about it generally that was so remarkable. The youth involvement really sort of made the campaign. And second, it was a violence prevention message. It was called the Public Safety, the Health and Public Safety Act. So just in terms of understanding what messages might work, it was a youth fund for kids 0 to 24, couched as a health and public safety measure. The second campaign happened in South San Francisco, which was, honestly, I prayed for that campaign and it came so close, and it was the most idealistic campaign I have ever seen. It was the most progressive tax I have ever seen. It was a tax on basically the biotech industries that own about 20 pieces of property in South San Francisco. And they were going to raise $60 million, enough to start every childcare worker at $70,000 a year, enough to give free childcare to every person who lived or worked in South San Francisco. It was an awesome effort with awesome volunteers who collected signatures voluntarily, and then had a $500,000 campaign from the biotech industry mounted against them. It was relentless. It was TV. It was digital. It was every day something in your mailbox. It was, and 3 city council members hated it because the biotech industry is, they see as the economic engine. I don't need to go into it. We were right. They were wrong. It wouldn't have destroyed South San Francisco at all. And it got 47% of the vote. They spent $100 grand to the $500,000 and came so close and had a ballot argument, a ballot question that was written by the city council, that said, do you support a tax, a voter initiated tax? And nowhere in the, main part of the ballot handbook did it say early care. So 47%, do it again, you win. Then we had a campaign in Monterey, which was like a model campaign. It was amazing. They had the most amazing coalition I have ever seen. And they really worked at, working with the potential opposition. I mean, they had to rewrite the ballot once, to make sure that they exempted agriculture, which could have killed this thing. It was a property tax. They had the anti-tax, the head of one of the leaders of the anti-tax movement in Monterey, become part of the steering committee, and who is now the most committed child advocate. I just spoke with him a couple of days ago, you ever want to see. And, they conducted a magnificent campaign, and they only got 41% of the vote. So we're going to talk about what we learned. They had great media, great endorsements, et cetera. So I'm going to go through quickly some of the lessons that I learned and that we all learned. Basically, in San Diego, they decided not to put a measure on the ballot because they didn't, think they were ready, but they put a measure of the ballot tweaking the administrative code so they could build childcare in the parks. Well, that turned out to be a wonderful training ground. So part of the lesson is start with some low-hanging fruit, get your hands wet with a ballot measure. Lesson number 2, the environment you have no, there are aspects of the environment you have no control over. Inflation killed the Monterey measure. I'm sure of it. You know, and it was not something that we could have prepared for. So you can't know. On the other hand, issues around public safety in Sacramento, which had some terrible incidents, actually helped the Sacramento measure, which was framed as public safety. Next thing, these are in no particular orders about taxes. Taxes are hard. They are fucking hard. And we have to learn better how to talk about taxes, how to convince people that if you're paying your taxes for other people's kids, that that is a good thing. And the public education that needs to go on around that, I think is, you know, we really need to do a better job of. On the other hand, I would say what people can do and did do is build the most amazing constituencies and coalitions and partnerships that they never could have built had they not put something on the ballot. There is something about putting something on the ballot that really rallies people to the cause and gives you an opportunity to organize and build partnerships that you simply don't have an opportunity to do in any other way. These lessons are not in any order, but about the opposition. You know, we think we're wonderful and nobody opposes kids. Well, you know, guess again. That measure, that, you know, totally benign measure in San Diego, it got 69% of the vote. 31% of the people oppose this, you know, measure that should have had zero opposition. 30% will oppose anything, I am convinced. And so the opposition, you know, had we had early money in South San Francisco, we could have fought off the you know, the biotech industry better. People have to learn to negotiate, and they did it in Monterey. They didn't have any formal opposition. My favorite negotiate with the opposition story is from Sacramento. Their second measure they tried was opposed by the fire department, which has endless amount of money and credibility and gets more money in your local budget than anything else. What did they do? They made a deal with the fire department. What's it going to take to have you support us? And they have part of the youth fund, children and youth fund, is going to go to train firemen, you know, young people as fire safety, as potential firemen. It was a magnificent example of negotiating with the opposition. The authentic voices that were involved, the winning campaigns in California have involved parents or youth. And that has been a key winning part of the campaigns. And I would say the lesson that just broke my heart, I feel like I'll never learn it well enough, is that how the thing gets framed in the public space is a huge part. How the measure gets written up, how people talk about it. Do they talk about it as a tax, or do they talk about it as service to kids? And is it just us talking about it as service to kids and other people are talking about it as a tax, which is something we learned a lot about. Learned a lot about coalitions, and they can be fragile and fickle, and people join your coalition and endorsements, and then they don't help your campaign. And so we have to talk about deeper partnerships and making sure we have them before we go to the ballot. And of course, my favorite message is never give up. You know, 3 times in Sacramento, twice in Alameda, 3 measures in Richmond, and each one had a huge amount of success and momentum and public education and organizing capacity. We lost a campaign in Napa in 2016. It was heartbreaking. And the leader of the campaign said, you know, the only way we're going to win is get our person on the local legislative body, on the Board of Supervisors. Well, I am happy to tell you she was head of the Family Resource Center. Then she became head of First Five, and she just won her campaign for county supervisor for the county of Napa. And it's an example of how you never know the ripple effect of this, and you never know all the ways this is going to impact the future of kids. And now that she's on the Board of Supervisors, I guarantee we're going to have a lot of wins.
More to come on that.
More to come on that.
Yeah,
Yes.
great. Okay, so we're going to move over to the middle of the country and to my buddy from my state, Missouri. Todd Patterson is a political strategist that supports a lot of stuff that we do at Children's Funding Project, but also has just over the years supported a lot of work in Missouri. Do you want to tell us the really heartening, exciting news coming out of Jackson County?
Yes.
And any other reflections you have as just a longtime political junkie?
Sure, Elizabeth, thank you. And hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Jackson County, Missouri is located on the western side of the state, and within it is contained most of the city of Kansas City. That comprises about half the county. The other half of the county is suburban and somewhat exurban as you move farther to the east. So it tends to be a progressive county, very small p. Okay, it's maybe maybe purple at best in the way it behaves in statewide elections. There was a fund established in 2016 that passed with 59% of the vote in that November election that was slapped with a sunset, so it had to be renewed. And the original levy that was proposed was cut in half. Okay. Missouri state law allows these children's funds to be established either by property tax or sales tax, and the sales tax levy can be up to 1/4 cent. Well, the local county legislature cut that levy in half in 2016, so they won, but with only 1/8 cent sales tax. Okay, so we looked at the landscape. You know, they could have gone in November of 22, which we did. Another option would have been an off-year election in 23 for renewal, but we decided to do it this year. And early polling told us that we had the potential to do that. The proposal this year was to double the levy and to eliminate the sunset. Okay. Interestingly, in early polling, we had slightly more support for doubling the levy than eliminating the sunset. But the steering committee of the campaign decided to go for broke, to go for both, and that's what we did. We began the campaign with 54% support, our initial polling in the fall of 21. And that also included 34% opposition and about 14% undecided. That 20-point gap didn't give us a lot of insurance to move forward. You really want to see a 30-point gap between for and against, ideally, or at least your support being over 60% before a get-go. So we decided to turn to the philanthropic community in the Kansas City region, which is abundant for the city of its size, and to do a very robust public education campaign on behalf of the fund. Okay, so while we spent $425,000 on the campaign itself, we spent nearly another $400,000 on public education, which was exclusively paid digital. Okay, that effort moved our numbers by the spring of 22 to 63% support, 23% opposition, and with the remainder undecided. So we really had a jump. And one lesson learned is the value of public education in which C3 monies can be used is more important than it ever has been before. In Missouri, in these campaigns, it usually comprised about 1/3 of all of the investment made. In this instance, it was half. Okay, and it really got us to the place where we could propel the campaign forward. The final tally was 75% for, 25% against in November. We had a different type of engagement this time around than we usually have. Usually we had to hang our hats solely on women and make sure they got out to vote, and it tended to be older women because they are more dependable voters than younger women. Well, thanks to the Dobbs decision, unfortunate as that was, more younger women turned out to vote. They registered, they engaged, they mobilized, and many of them mobilized on our behalf, as well as other things on the ballot, but really got behind our issue. What we also found from our paid digital is that more men engaged in the issue. than they had in the past. And these were mainly middle-aged men, and they were mainly suburban middle-aged men, which, as we've seen due to the pandemic, a lot of issues in local school districts and that sort of thing have reared their heads for better or for worse. And we kind of credit their engagement to those issues, those pandemic-related issues that made them engage in our issue farther. So we had expected maybe at the best a 66% win, but we got a 75% win. And largely, we believe, to those two factors, younger women and middle-aged men who were not there with us before. So the three lessons learned, one which I already described, is that the importance of public education, a robust public education budget, which philanthropy, other C3 organizations can readily engage, is more important than ever. We also found that ballot language is as important as it ever was before, because due to social media and due to people's access to information, a lot of people have access to the ballot language earlier and pay attention to it more than they ever had. So in the ballot language that we crafted, instead of saying tax increase, we just called it an extension. Okay. We made no mention at all about a sunset. I mean, so the new measure that they were approving was not going to contain a sunset. That's what they were voting for. It did not have a sunset present. So we did not say anything about eliminating the sunset in the language at all. So ballot language was more important than it has been in these past efforts. And we really spent a lot of time and really went through the legal laundry, to make sure that it was on point. Finally, it was getting the local opinion leaders, but especially the county commissioners, in our case, they're called legislators, getting their support. Because of the challenges for signature collection, okay, because the lack of labor, there is a labor shortage, and the collection of signatures has gotten much more expensive than it has been in previous cycles. We had to depend upon placement by the 9-member county legislature. We started with 3 yes votes in the fall of 21. They placed it unanimously by July of 2022. Key in getting them to engage and positively engage in our ballot placement was that we held public fora, and we invited them to be headliners in that, where we built a public audience for them to speak about the measure, or to listen to others speak about the measure. So it created a real momentum in the eyes of the legislators that this thing was important to their constituents, that it had momentum, and that they better act in the affirmative. And they did. So having that ballot placement unanimously was also a big help. You're going to find, as you move through cycles, the labor shortage isn't improving that much, and signature collection is still going to have its challenges next cycle. So taking a few lessons in legislative lobbying, or your organization may actually want to hire a lobbyist to carry your issue to the legislature, is probably more important than it has been in the past. We always like we always like ballot placement by signature because it engaged the public. But it has become so expensive and so undependable because of labor that we may want to begin looking at legislative placement as a more durable avenue. So,
Todd, when we come back to questions at the end, think about overall costs, because yes, signature gathering, but there was a question up in the chat, or you can answer it on the chat, about paid digital and the numbers associated, like how much you needed to do to get how much, additional turnout, or if the science isn't there yet. But just look up in the chat and see.
That's right.
What the question is. So we're going to turn over to Dave Metz of FM3. And he's the pollster that we typically will go to on things like this, because he just does a lot of deep dives into communities around the country. Just tell us the zeitgeist of the voters on children, and just the impact that some of these other external factors are having on where their heads were.
Yeah. Well, thanks, first of all, to you and to everyone attending today. It's a pleasure to be here and to sort of start to reflect about what we have learned from this year's elections. The zeitgeist was pretty terrible. I think it's hard to come up with a better word to describe it. Heading into this election, over 70% of Americans said they believe that the country is on the wrong track. That's the highest number that we have seen in a midterm election over the course of the last 30 years. In addition, paired with that, we've seen a bunch of data to indicate that it is not just that people are feeling high levels of economic anxiety right now, but they are fundamentally questioning whether the kind of economic opportunity that they have always trusted America to provide is something that they can count on for themselves and for the next generation. There's a polling question that I can't remember if it's Pew or Gallup has asked many times over the years, which is, do you expect your children to be better off than you were? And for years in America, that the answer was a resounding yes. 70–80% of Americans would say yes, absolutely they do. Starting within the last 4 or 5 years now, that is no longer the case. And most Americans believe that their children are going to be worse off than they are. That is a really tough environment to sort of get people to be willing to tax themselves, to be willing to sort of bet on government writ large, to do things to be helpful. But obviously, it's also a time when people may be realizing that kids need help, that we can't just count on a rising economic tide and sort of the traditional American ladder of opportunity to be there to sort of benefit the next generation the way it has the past. And so I think given these conflicting forces, what we saw were some mixed results when it came to ballot measures this year. But frankly, given the sort of the weight of the headwinds that we were facing, I'm happy and pleased to see the way that a lot of these, a lot of these elections turned out. One factor that we need to keep in mind is voter turnout, and I think there was a risk, as a general principle, higher turnout benefits measures for investing in kids. It means you have more younger voters. It means you have more Democrats and independents. It means you have, generally speaking, more voters who are in working families who are facing economic struggles. And given all of that, tend to be more yes voters among those populations. We had overall the highest voter turnout that we have had in a midterm election, with the exception of 2018, which sort of blew away all of the records in the middle of the Trump administration. Obviously, ballots are still sort of being finalized here, and we'll have more definitive counts on turnout shortly, but it looks like we're just a couple of points nationally behind where we were in 2018, which overall tends to be good news. And it's also been the case that over the last couple of years, the segments of the electorate whose turnout has been increasing most greatly tend to be younger voters, tend to be BIPOC voters, tend to be also white college graduates. All three of those, generally, very good groups for voting for support for kids. But unfortunately, it is not the case that that turnout was sort of uniform all over the country. And as I think our colleagues here from Monterey County can tell, they ended up with only 103,000 people participating in the election, which was about 20,000 short of what our turnout estimates would have suggested were likely to turn out. And part of that is in a deep blue state like California, with a governor's race at the top of the ballot that was a complete snoozer. No state ballot measures that really excited or animated people. There wasn't a whole lot to turn voters out. All of the competitive congressional races and a lot of the competitive legislative races were all in Southern California. And so there just wasn't a big driver to get people to the ballot. And so I think that certainly affected things in Monterey, as it probably did in a number of other places around the country. We saw the converse situation in Whatcom, as Olivia described. Excellent turnout there. Obviously, that's a state that always has high turnout because it's all vote by mail and has been for a while. California is now too, but it's sort of a newer phenomenon that they're still getting used to. In terms of the issues that were motivating voters, what we basically saw was that the economy was kind of an overhang on everything. In most polls, people would say that inflation and the cost of living were their biggest concern. And those voters tended to be ones who overwhelmingly voted Republican in the election in partisan races. And those voters also tended to be skeptical of ballot measures, especially those that had an impact on taxes. In many of our campaigns, we actually didn't poll in 2022. In both Whatcom and Monterey counties, we had polling from the end of 2021 that was guiding us, but a lot of the sort of big upticks in concern about inflation and the cost of living happened this year. I do think, I mean, the data shows and just the campaigns did a really good job of recognizing that fact and building coalitions. Margaret touched on this earlier, that included members of the business community who are often opposing local taxes. That included, in some cases, taxpayer advocates who almost always oppose local taxes. And part of that was because we have this very compelling argument that investments in early childhood, investments in childcare are critical to our economy, both in helping parents be able to get back to work, but also in helping those kids benefit at the earliest years of their lives in ways that are going to yield a stronger economy down the road. And so messaging that has validators that aren't often on the side of supporting taxes, that we're able to make that case. And having an absence of opponents in some cases who might be making that case otherwise, I think was really, really helpful. And I think it's a good indicator, even when we get out of the kind of economic environment we're in, the ability to build those kinds of broad coalitions is going to be really important. I think this election was also somewhat of a test of the salience of issues relating to early childhood as compared to some of these things that we know were at the top of voters' minds: the economy, abortion, crime, immigration. And while the polling has showed that voters understand the importance of early childhood, it wasn't something that was getting a lot of talk and attention the way that some of those other issues are. It wasn't sort of a part of the national conversation the same way. But I think we did have the benefit of coming out of the pandemic, and a lot of the polling that we've done over the last 2 or 3 years shows that it really was a wake-up call for a lot of families themselves, but I think also just for a lot of Americans to understand how tenuous and fragile our system of investments in early childhood is, that we are relying on a workforce that is dramatically underpaid, that we are relying on providers. We don't have enough providers, and the ones that we have are making it by a shoestring. And when we get the kind of economic dislocation we got over the last couple of years, many of them aren't capable of withstanding it. And so it sort of the pandemic's shown a spotlight on this vulnerability that we have and the consequences of the underinvestment that we have made over the course of recent decades. And I think a lot of that messaging and just sort of as being something that was in the background that people were aware of, the experiences that they had, that those close to them had over the course of the last couple of years, hopefully helped to elevate the urgency a little bit. But we didn't have the benefit of wind at our backs, of a national conversation about this, or candidates who were running for those top of the ticket offices who were making it a priority. And I think that's something that really could be beneficial to us down the road. If we've got, outside of the context of these campaigns doing all this fantastic work that they did on their own, the more that we have this being something that's getting talked about as something that Senate candidates and candidates for governor and state legislature are talking about, the better off we're going to be.
Nobody here tell anybody, but 2024 is what we're really looking at. Okay, so we're gonna do this. There's all these great questions that came in, and I want to just like call out some that stood out to me. I went through with a highlighter, and raise your hand if you want to answer it. Okay, to the panelists here, we'll let you just duke it out on who gets to answer each question. So here's one about bipartisan messaging. What would be recommended bipartisan messaging, or what did you see that maybe was successful in securing some of these wins that really had a bipartisan bent to it? Anybody want to say anything about that?
I mean, I feel like by definition, it's a bipartisan message. It's about your kids, the next generation, et cetera. So I don't know what to do to make it more bipartisan.
Right. Yes, I hear that. Todd, I know in 2020, that was a big part of how you saw some folks winning. It's by really making sure that their messaging was reaching all kinds of voters. did you see that this year too at Jackson County or in other places, or?
Absolutely. You have to meet voters where they are, and that's in the language you convey to them. And as I'm noting here in the chat, that public events, public meetings, public fora, whatever you want to call them, and meeting with these particular specific constituent groups is now more important than it was, because as the pandemic has subsided, people are more willing to gather and meet and listen. So making sure you have not only the right messages, but the right messengers in those situations is important.
Great. What about, what specific wins do you think we saw that might be reproducible in other parts of the country? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Maybe Olivia? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the state level, I think we're seeing more states take action to dedicate funding. Specifically, I think identifying what is unique in your community. In this can be tricky, it can go both ways, because the unique things are often economic drivers, which may come with well-funded opposition, as we saw in South San Francisco. But in the case of New Mexico, they identified a unique aspect of their economy that they were able to tap into. And those, in addition to things that tax high-income earners or large corporations, tend to be the most popular things and feel like a thing that people understand there may be a surplus of. So I think that is something I've been telling folks at the state and local level to look at, what makes their community unique that they can tap into as an asset.
Great. What about the sort of future as we look to 2023, 2024? What should communities that are thinking about doing this be watching out for in those coming cycles, either from like voter trends or multiple efforts that have tried over time and had to go back again, or anybody want to tackle future trends you see coming in the
But for local measures, I see, like, look at what's happening in your local community, like this public safety issue that emerged in Sacramento, not other places maybe, but that, tag on to something specific that's happening. Or, one of the issues is homelessness. It's just this huge issue. So it's also about partnerships. Should we be partnering more with advocates for, homeless families or mental health advocates as issues come to the core that really are capturing people's attention?
And that's a really good point. That's something Whatcom County utilized. And I think sometimes people get a little squeamish about the idea of like, well, should we be using, the housing crisis, quote unquote, using that as a way to motivate people? But I think we forget that people don't necessarily connect the dots on how hard it is for children and families experiencing housing instability to get things like basic health care, basic child care, and how those difficulties keep folks entrenched in housing instability. So helping to spell the connection out for folks to the issues they care about is less like shady messaging and is more actually smart public education. And I think we need to take advantage of that more the way Whatcom County did.
Nice.
And just to reinforce Olivia's point, we don't have to tell people that we are going to solve this other problem. It is not that voting for our measure will solve homelessness. It won't, and we aren't contending that it will. But voters get that things like homelessness or public safety, for Margaret's example, are big, multifaceted problems that have lots of root causes that have to be addressed sort of one by one. And for us to be able to say credibly, because it is what we are doing, that we are identifying a piece of that problem and taking a meaningful step to try to address it. As Olivia said, we should not be shy or bashful in any way about making that case. We're not overselling what we're doing. And if we're not, we shouldn't be at all timid about making those connections.
I got focused on listening and then I forgot what my next question was going to be, which is going to be drum roll. So there's a lot of folks on, and we've seen a lot of more recent ballot measures really focus in on early childhood, both infants and toddlers, and universal pre-K has been very popular, even though we have questions about what universal exactly means across this country, but talk though about if any of these current measures or into the future you think there's room for older youth, and it kind of ties back to that question about some of the public safety concerns that are going on in many settings across the country. So I don't know, what do you think about the viability of youth-related measures, I guess is the question.
Well, it's the big winners in California have been youth related in Richmond and in Sacramento. And young people are totally jazzed and can get really involved in campaigns. And it's not superficial. It's real, and it adds so much energy. I think there's a lot of room for youth campaigns now, and that relating it to public safety, it makes, it's sort of ugly in some ways, but makes a lot of sense.
This is the question I was going to ask. Special sort of revenue types to look out for in the coming years. Like what are some of the things that we think might be, there's some communication power between the marijuana revenue and supporting our young people, right? There's some, so what are some of the things that you think we should be keeping our eye out for? Set-asides.
Public loves it.
California's into
Set-aside,
time.
and we didn't have time to go into all the specifics of what you can and can't do in California. So come to our January 12th meeting where we're going to, for people who want to run campaigns in 2024, but setting aside existing dollars is a winner.
Yeah.
But you have to do it by signatures because elected officials will never agree to it.
And I think there's room for creative set-asides, like the marijuana set-aside, which wasn't a set-aside of marijuana revenue, but was a set-aside of an amount equivalent to marijuana revenue that was more than what had been projected to come in. And in New Mexico, it's in a lot of ways a set-aside of existing revenue that the state wasn't drawing down. I also think folks need that. I don't know if folks understand how much more popular high income earners taxes are than other types of taxes. They are not accessible to a lot of localities in this country. Your state doesn't provide localities with the authority to levy them in a lot of places, but in the places they do, they're incredibly popular. And Massachusetts actually passed a statewide high income earners tax on this ballot for public education this year, which is just one more in a series of that. And I know Dave can speak to that in polling, which are most popular. Which
top 5 revenue types to voters. Come on, Dave.
Yeah, basically voters are extremely enthusiastic about taxing people other than themselves. These are the kinds of brilliant insights you can get from polling, and it has ever been thus, and it remains true. And so, what that means is it's not just wealthy individuals, but it is also wealthy businesses. We have seen that taxes on high earning corporations or sales of corporate property or things like that can also be very popular. Now, of course, that means you're picking a fight with people who can spend a lot of money. And as Margaret was just describing in South San Francisco, that resulted in significant opposition. But opposition that in better circumstances might have been able to be overcome just given the way that the public feels about these issues.
It was close.
It was very close. And I would also note that the category of sin taxes, what we refer to as sin taxes, has sort of been growing here as more and more states are adopting legal marijuana, as Todd has been describing. And we've also seen sports wagering. Which about half of states, I believe, have now legalized, and others, like California, $1 billion in campaigning later, ultimately will, probably sometime next election cycle. Voters see these as big pots of money that don't come out of their pockets, and kids are among the recipients that they think are most worthy of investment coming from these sources. So obviously, the local context matters a lot, but I think those are mechanisms that we ought to be keeping a close eye on.
I just want to thank you guys for an honest, frank conversation about where we're at. I think the bottom line is there were no, very clear trends that we saw across the country on this, but that a lot of folks were working really hard in this handful of communities to make this happen. And I doubt that they will stop working really hard, Margaret, if they weren't successful this time. And as we sort of reflect on these recent elections, the seismic shift in federal resources that communities are grappling with right now from American Rescue Plan and prior, I mean, that's a big player here. That, you know, there are deep needs that we're seeing coming out of COVID in all corners of the country for better supports and opportunities for children and young people and families. And so we're just hopeful that all of the folks on this webinar will join in on this movement of local communities that are working to roll up their sleeves and get this done. And it's hard, and it's, you know, but it's gratifying work. So watch for your inboxes to have a follow-up email with all of these links that Kristen has been busy putting into the chat here. Thank you, Kristen. And that'll have the recording and the slides and the other resources. And then we will be having this blog come out next week with a recap of the highlights. And if you're from California and you want more Margaret time, which is just fun, you don't even have to be from California to have more Margaret time in your upcoming meeting. Well, you probably do. You probably do need to be from California. Register for the January 12 information session for groups considering a 2024.
And for California
ballot.
people, we're doing a big poll in March with Dave, and we'll have a lot of answers that will help people. Where in California is it possible? What measures are possible, et cetera. So I want people to know that's on the horizon.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much. And onward, I guess.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.